of a foot soldier. The Dublin skyline, a mix of historic charm and modern glass, tells a story of a city on the rise. But for every story of progress, there is a darker one, a story written in the shadows. This is a story not of a kingpin, but of a lieutenant, a man who operated in the grim trenches of the Irish drug trade. His name was Liam Roe, but on the streets they called him Bop. And his life and brutal end would become a stark symbol of the price of power in the Kinahan-Hutch feud. To understand how Liam Roe fell, we must first understand how he rose. He was not born into royalty. He was a product of the inner-city streets of Dublin's north side, an area where opportunity can be scarce, and the lure of quick money and respect is a powerful force. In these neighborhoods, the line between community and criminality is often blurred. Young men like Liam Roe looked at the flashy cars and expensive clothes of local gangsters and saw a version of success that the legitimate world seemed to deny them. It was in this environment that Liam Bop Roe began his apprenticeship in crime. He started small, as most do, low-level dealing, acting as a runner, doing the odd jobs that the bigger players needed done. But he had attributes that were noticed. He was tough, reliable, and possessed a certain street-smart intelligence. Most importantly, he was loyal. And in the world he was entering, loyalty was the currency that could buy you a promotion. His ascent coincided with the rise of the Kinahan Cartel as the dominant force in Irish and UK narcotics. What started as a family-run operation was expanding into a multinational, multi-billion euro empire. And empires need soldiers. They need enforcers, distributors, and lieutenants who can be trusted to manage territory and generate profit. Liam Roe was being groomed for such a role. He was moving up the ladder, from a foot soldier to a trusted associate. His reputation grew on the streets. He was known as a hardened individual, not one to be crossed. This reputation was his armor and his weapon. It commanded fear and respect in equal measure, which in the drug trade are often the same thing. But this rise was not happening in a vacuum. The criminal landscape of Ireland was shifting, and tectonic plates were grinding against each other. The Kinahan Cartel, led by Christy Kinahan Sr. and his sons Daniel and Christopher Jr., was facing challenges. Alliances were being tested, and rivalries were simmering. For a man like Liam Roe, this meant that his position was becoming more dangerous by the day. Being a high-profile member of the Kinahan organization was no longer just about making money. It was about taking sides in a war that was yet to be formally declared. The money was good, the power was intoxicating, but the target on his back was growing larger. He was no longer just Liam Roe from the north side. He was Bop, a Kinahan man, and that identity came with a heavy price. He had to be constantly aware of his surroundings, watching his back, trusting very few. The paranoia that grips high-level criminals began to set in. Every unfamiliar car, every stranger's glance could be a potential threat. This was the life he had chosen, or perhaps the life that had chosen him. The streets that once offered him a path to riches were now a potential hunting ground. He was both the hunter and the hunted. His social media profiles, like so many of his generation, showed flashes of this dual life. Pictures of family and friends, alongside subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, displays of wealth and status. It was a digital footprint that mapped his journey from aspiring gangster to established player. But every post, every boastful picture, was also evidence. It was a signal to his enemies of his location, his affiliations, and his confidence. Meanwhile, the Kinahan Cartel's operations were becoming more brazen. The flow of drugs from South America and Europe into Ireland and the UK was a well-oiled machine, and Liam Roe was one of the cogs in that machine, ensuring the product moved and the money flowed. He was involved in the gritty realities of the trade, logistics, collections, and enforcement. It was a world of cash-filled duffel bags, encrypted phones, and sudden, brutal violence. The glamorous facade portrayed in movies was a lie. The reality was stressful, dirty, and perpetually fraught with danger. By the time the infamous boxing weigh-in at the Regency Hotel took place in February 2016, Liam Roe was a confirmed and known lieutenant within the Kinahan structure. The attack at the Regency, where Kinahan associate David Byrne was murdered by a Hutch-linked gang, was not just an escalation, it was a declaration of all-out war. The carefully maintained, if volatile, peace between the Kinahan and Hutch factions shattered into a million pieces. For men like Liam Roe, the rules of the game had vanished. The Regency attack signaled that no one was off limits. It was a move of breathtaking audacity that sent shockwaves through the criminal underworld and legitimate society alike. For the Kinahan Cartel, it was an inexcusable act of disrespect that demanded a brutal and overwhelming response. The response was swift and merciless. A series of murders and attempted murders followed, tit for tat, back and forth, painting the streets of Dublin in blood. The Gardaí launched major operations, but the cycle of violence seemed to have a momentum of its own. In this new hyper-violent landscape, Liam Roe's position became exponentially more perilous. He was now a key target for the Hutch faction. His every move would be watched, his routine studied, his vulnerabilities sought. The man who had worked so hard to build a reputation now found that same reputation was a death sentence. The pressure was immense. The life of a cartel lieutenant, once seen as a position of power, was now a gilded cage. He was trapped by his own success, a marked man in a war with no end in sight. He couldn't step down, he couldn't walk away. The only way out, it seemed, was in a box. The making of the foot soldier was complete. Liam Bop Roe had achieved the status he once craved, but he was now standing at the edge of a precipice, looking into an abyss of violence that would soon consume him. His story was about to enter its most dangerous and final chapter. And as the war raged on, his name was moving to the top of a very dark list. To truly understand the depth of this conflict and the forces that sealed his fate, you need to follow the story into the heart of the cartel's operations, the international connections, the money laundering, and the global hunt that would eventually encircle the organization he served. For a deeper dive into the dark underworld of international crime and the stories they never want you to hear, make sure you are subscribed to the Dark Deduce channel. We unravel the mysteries, one thread at a time. A lieutenant in a blood feud. The Regency Hotel attack was a shock to the system, but for the foot soldiers and lieutenants of the Kinahan Cartel, it was more than a shock. It was a call to arms. A line had been crossed, and the response would need to be absolute. In the days and weeks that followed, the criminal landscape of Dublin transformed into a battlefield, and for Liam Bop Roe, the world shrank to the size of a crosshair. His life before the feud, with its relative freedoms and public displays, was over. He was now a full-time participant in a gangland war. His role within the cartel shifted from profit generation to survival and retaliation. He became a key figure in the Kinahan's Dublin command structure. This wasn't about selling drugs anymore. It was about securing territory, protecting assets, and eliminating threats. The Hutch faction had proven they could strike at the very heart of the Kinahan organization, in a crowded hotel, in broad daylight. No one felt safe. For Liam Roe, this meant a life lived in the shadows. The casual meetings in pubs, the flashy nights out in city center clubs, all of that ceased. Every movement was calculated. Routes were varied constantly. Safe houses were utilized. Trust, always a rare commodity, became almost non-existent. He was surrounded by a small, tight-knit group of associates, all of them bound by their loyalty to the cartel and their fear of the alternative. Paranoia was no longer a state of mind, it was a necessary survival skill. The Gardaí were putting immense pressure on both sides. Raids were frequent, surveillance was intense. The police knew who the key players were, and Liam Roe was high on that list. He was living under the twin pressures of law enforcement and a ruthless enemy who wanted him dead. It was a pressure cooker existence, and the stress must have been immense. Yet he persisted. His reputation as a hardened and committed lieutenant grew within the underworld. He was seen as a reliable and ruthless operator, a man the cartel could count on in a crisis. This perception, while bolstering his status, also made him a priority target for the Hutch side. In a feud like this, taking out a key lieutenant is a strategic victory. It weakens the enemy's operational capacity and sends a message of strength. Liam Roe knew this. He knew that his name was on a list. Every day he remained alive and active was a small victory in itself. The violence was relentless. The tit-for-tat killings became a grim routine for the people of Dublin. A shooting in the north inner city would be followed by a shooting in the south. The media struggled to keep up with the body count. Each murder was investigated, but the code of silence, the fear of reprisals, made gathering evidence nearly impossible. The community was caught in the middle, terrified of speaking out. Liam Roe was operating in this environment of fear and silence. He was both a perpetrator of this violence and a potential victim of it. The lines between hunter and prey were constantly shifting. One day he could be planning an action, the next he could be evading one. Intelligence was the key. Both sides were desperate for information on the movements and habits of their enemies. This was a war fought with guns, but also with phones, with whispers, and with betrayal. It is believed that Liam Roe was deeply involved in this aspect of the war. The gathering of intelligence, the identification of targets, the planning of attacks. He was not just a foot soldier anymore. He was a tactician in a bloody urban conflict. His life was a series of safe houses, encrypted messages, and fleeting, secretive meetings. The man who once enjoyed the trappings of his ill-gotten wealth could no longer enjoy them publicly. The money was still there, but the freedom to spend it was gone. The flashy cars were now a liability, too easily identified. The designer clothes were replaced by nondescript hoodies and jackets, better for blending in, for staying invisible. This was the reality of being a lieutenant in the Kinahan-Hutch feud. It was a far cry from the glamorous image of the gangster. It was a life of constant vigilance, isolation, and fear. The weight of that existence must have been crushing. Friends became enemies overnight. Alliances shifted. You could only trust the people immediately around you, and even that trust was conditional. The psychological toll on Liam Roe and his associates would have been enormous. Every car backfiring was a gunshot. Every slow-moving vehicle was a potential threat. Sleep would have been elusive, punctuated by the anxiety of a sudden attack. This was the price of his position. This was the consequence of the path he had chosen years earlier. The young man seeking respect on the streets of North Dublin was now a seasoned, hardened criminal, living every moment as if it could be his last. The feud was escalating, and the Gardaí were making high-profile arrests, but the violence seemed unstoppable. The cycle of revenge had taken on a life of its own. Each side felt justified,
Each side felt wronged, and each side was willing to kill to prove a point. Liam Bop Roe was in the eye of this storm, a key player in the most significant gangland conflict in Irish history. His every move was watched, his every decision critical. He was a man trapped by his own reputation, fighting a war with no end in sight and no way out. The walls were closing in, and the options were dwindling. The pressure was building toward a single, violent moment. His story was approaching its inevitable, brutal conclusion. To understand the final act and the international criminal empire that shaped his destiny, you need to see the bigger picture. The international network of the Kinahan Cartel, spanning continents and involving billions. For a clearer view into the shadowy world of international crime syndicates, make sure you are subscribed to Dark Deduce channel. We connect the dots, no matter how far apart they are.
The noose tightens. For Liam Bop Roe, the years following the Regency attack were a masterclass in survival. He was a ghost in his own city, a specter moving through the streets he once dominated. But a ghost can still be hunted. The pressure was not just coming from one direction. It was a multi-front siege. The Hutch faction wanted him dead. The Gardaí wanted him behind bars. And perhaps most ominously, his own organization demanded unwavering loyalty and results in the face of an existential threat. The Gardaí had launched Operation Hybrid, a dedicated, intelligence-led initiative aimed specifically at dismantling the warring factions. This was not traditional policing. This was a counter-insurgency operation on the streets of Dublin. Surveillance teams became a constant presence in the lives of key players. Phone networks were compromised. Informants were cultivated. The net was slowly, methodically being drawn closed. For a man like Liam Roe, this meant his operational capacity was severely diminished. Every meeting was a risk, every phone call a potential trap. The Gardaí were not just reacting to crimes, they were proactively disrupting them, preventing murders before they could happen. This saved lives, but it also heightened the tension and frustration within the cartel. Lieutenants like Roe were under orders to strike back, to exact revenge, but the opportunities to do so were vanishing. They were being squeezed, and a cornered animal is always at its most dangerous. It was during this period that Liam Roe's name became publicly linked to the Feud. The media, piecing together information from court cases and Garda briefings, identified him as a significant Kinahan figure. His photograph was published. His alias, Bop, became a headline. His anonymity, a crucial layer of protection for any criminal, was stripped away. He was now a public enemy. This not only made him a more recognizable target for his enemies, but also increased the pressure on the Gardaí to bring him to justice. He was in the spotlight, and there was no stepping out of it. The financial operations of the cartel were also under unprecedented scrutiny. The Criminal Assets Bureau, a formidable entity in Irish law enforcement, began targeting the wealth of the Kinahan and Hutch factions. Cars, houses, cash, and luxury goods were seized under the proceeds of crime legislation. The message was clear. We will not only imprison you, we will take everything you have. For Liam Roe, this meant the rewards of his criminal life were being systematically confiscated. The money he had risked his life for was being taken by the state. The very foundation of his status, his wealth, was crumbling. He was fighting a war on two fronts, and he was losing on both. Internally, the dynamics of the Kinahan Cartel were also shifting. The core leadership, Daniel Kinahan and his inner circle, were primarily based in Dubai,
operating at a safe distance. The foot soldiers and lieutenants in Dublin were the ones bearing the brunt of the daily violence and police pressure. This physical separation created a disconnect. The orders from Dubai were absolute, but the men on the ground in Dublin were the ones facing the bullets and the prison cells. There must have been a growing sense of isolation. They were expendable pawns in a much larger game. Liam Rowe was one of these pawns, albeit a high-value one. His loyalty was being tested not just by enemy fire, but by the creeping realization that he was on his own. The transnational nature of the Kinahan Cartel meant that senior figures could orchestrate the war from the safety of their boltholes. But for Liam Rowe, there was no escape to Dubai. Dublin was his world, his battlefield, and it was becoming his prison. The stress of this existence was unimaginable. The constant fear, the paranoia, the isolation. He could trust no one. Old friends could be informants. New associates could be assassins. His family life would have been fractured, if not destroyed. How do you be a father, a son, a partner, when you are a primary target in a gangland war? Every visit home, every school run was a potential death trap for him and his loved ones. He was a danger to everyone around him. This is the true cost of a life of crime. It's not just the violence you inflict on others. It's the devastation you bring upon your own life and the lives of those you care about. By this point, Liam Rowe was likely a man stripped of everything but his reputation and his will to survive. The money was being seized, his freedom was severely restricted, his family life was in tatters, and his enemies were closing in. He was living on borrowed time, and everyone in the underworld knew it. The question was not if, but how. The noose was tightening with every passing day. The combined forces of the Hutch faction and the Irish state were creating an inescapable vortex. Liam Bop Roe was at the center of it, a man trapped by the consequences of his own choices, watching as all his exits were systematically sealed shut. His story was hurtling towards its brutal and inevitable climax. The final act was waiting in the wings, ready to play out on a quiet street in a moment of devastating violence. To understand the global machine that created this situation and the international efforts to bring it down, you need to look beyond Ireland. The story of the Kinahan Cartel is a global one. For more deep dives into the world's most dangerous criminal organizations, make sure you are subscribed to Dark Deduce channel. We go where the story leads, no matter the borders.
The House of Cards. For the police, the success of Operation Sequel was like holding a winning lottery ticket. They had done the impossible. They had placed a man inside David Hunt's inner circle, and that man had captured the crime boss's voice on tape, seemingly directing his criminal empire. The evidence was damning. It felt like the end of a long and arduous journey. The phantom was finally within their grasp. The intelligence gathered by Vincent was so comprehensive that it allowed prosecutors to build a formidable case. They weren't just going for a minor conviction, they were preparing to charge David Hunt with conspiracy to supply Class A drugs, conspiracy to commit armed robbery, and directing a criminal organization. These were charges that could put him away for decades, effectively ending his reign. The anticipation within Merseyside police was palpable. This was to be their landmark case, the one that would be studied for generations. It was the culmination of years of meticulous, dangerous work. The decision was made to move to the arrest phase. A date was set.
The plan was coordinated with military precision. Simultaneous dawn raids were planned across the Northwest, targeting Hunt and his key lieutenants simultaneously, to prevent any of them from destroying evidence or fleeing. The goal was to decapitate the syndicate in one swift, decisive blow. On the morning of the raids, armed police units surrounded a series of properties. The most significant target was Hunt's own home, a large, well-secured property. The door was breached. Police swarmed in, and there they found David Charles Hunt. The man they had been hunting for over a decade was arrested in his own home. He was reportedly calm, composed, almost expecting them. He was taken into custody along with several of his top associates. The news sent shockwaves through the criminal underworld. The untouchable David Hunt was behind bars. For the first time, his invincibility seemed like a myth. He was processed, charged, and remanded into custody awaiting trial. The police and the Crown Prosecution Service were confident. They had the tapes. They had the undercover officer's testimony. They had financial records that corroborated the conversations. It looked, to the outside world, like a slam-dunk case. But inside the legal system, a storm was brewing. The defense team for David Hunt was formidable. They were some of the best and most expensive criminal lawyers in the country. Their strategy was not to prove Hunt's innocence, but to attack the prosecution's case with relentless surgical precision. They filed a series of legal challenges, arguing that the evidence gathered by the undercover officer was inadmissible. They claimed entrapment, that the officer had not just observed crime, but had actively encouraged and participated in it, effectively manufacturing the evidence. This is a classic and often effective defense strategy in undercover operations. The defense began to pick apart every aspect of the case. They challenged the authorization of the undercover operation itself. They demanded to see the full, unedited logs of Vincent's activities, arguing that the context of the conversations was crucial. They filed motion after motion, creating a mountain of legal paperwork and procedural delays. The pretrial hearings became a battleground, a war of attrition fought in stuffy courtrooms rather than on the streets. The prosecution was forced onto the defensive, spending more time fighting legal technicalities than presenting the core of their evidence. But then something far more sinister began to happen. The climate of fear that David Hunt had cultivated for years started to seep into the judicial process. Witnesses who were due to testify began to get cold feet. Some received anonymous threats. Others were reminded, in not-so-subtle ways, of the consequences of cooperation. The reputation of the Hunt Syndicate for brutal retaliation was not just a rumor. It was a powerful tool that was now being deployed to protect its leader. Key individuals who were crucial to the money laundering and fraud aspects of the case suddenly became unavailable or changed their statements. The case, which had once seemed so solid, began to look like a house of cards, vulnerable to the slightest breeze. And then the breeze came. It became clear that the credibility of the undercover officer, Vincent, was going to be the central focus of the trial. The defense was prepared to subject his every action, every word, to microscopic scrutiny. They would paint him as an agent provocateur, a liar who had overstepped his legal boundaries. The psychological toll on Vincent, who had already sacrificed so much, would be immense. Faced with these overwhelming challenges, the legal delays, the intimidated witnesses, and the risk to their key officer, the Crown Prosecution Service was forced to make an agonizing decision. Just weeks before the trial was scheduled to begin, they offered a deal. They would drop the most serious charges against David Hunt, including directing a criminal organization, if he would plead guilty to a lesser charge. It was a compromise, a stark admission that taking him down for everything was a risk they could no longer take. In a dramatic courtroom moment, the deal was accepted. David Charles Hunt, the man suspected of running a vast, violent empire, pleaded guilty to a single count of conspiracy to commit armed robbery, relating to a plot to steal a shipment of cigarettes. The judge, acknowledging the seriousness of the offense, sentenced him to 6 years in prison. 6 years. For a man accused of so much more, it was merely a slap in the wrist. The police were devastated. Their years of work, the immense risk taken by their undercover officer, had resulted in a sentence that felt like a defeat. David Hunt was going to prison, but he was not being held accountable for the true scale of his crimes. The myth of the untouchable crime boss had not been shattered. It had been reinforced. He had beaten the system. The syndicate had weathered its biggest storm. And as Hunt was led away to begin his sentence, a new question emerged. What would happen to his empire while the king was temporarily dethroned? Would it crumble without its leader? Or was the Hunt syndicate, like any good corporation, built to survive the absence of its CEO?
The aftermath and a global war. The killing of Liam Bop Roe was not an end. It was a punctuation mark in an ongoing story of violence and retribution. In the immediate aftermath, the streets of Dublin held their breath. The Gardaí braced for the inevitable Kinahan response. A murder of this profile, this brazenness, demanded a counterstrike. The fear of an all-out escalation hung heavy in the air. The scene on Ventry Drive became a grim landmark. A forensic tent, Garda tape, and the silent, bullet-riddled BMW served as a stark public reminder of the feud's reach. For days, the technical bureaus scoured every inch of the scene. Every shell casing was a piece of a puzzle. Every potential witness was a thread that could lead to the killers. But the investigation, as expected, ran into the same old wall. Silence. The code of Omerta was firmly in place. People were terrified, and with good reason. The same individuals who could carry out such a clinical hit on a high-profile target like Roe would not hesitate to eliminate anyone who spoke to the police. The passenger who survived the attack became the investigation's most crucial and most difficult witness. He had seen the faces of the killers. He had lived through the horror. But his survival depended on his silence, both from his own injuries and from the threat that speaking out would put a new target on his back. He represented the impossible dilemma at the heart of this feud. To talk is to die. Meanwhile, the Kinahan Cartel was not idle. The murder of a trusted lieutenant like Roe was a deep wound. It demanded a response to maintain their authority and deter future attacks. Exactly 1 week after Roe's assassination, on February 21st, another shooting occurred. This time the target was a 47-year-old man with links to the Hutch faction in the Sheriff Street area. He was shot multiple times, but like Roe's passenger, he miraculously survived. The Gardaí believed this was a direct retaliation for the Roe hit. The cycle was continuing, the wheel of violence turning once more. Blood demanded blood. But the story of Liam Roe's death extends far beyond the streets of Dublin. It became a key piece of evidence in a much larger global narrative. In the weeks and months following the killing, the international pressure on the Kinahan Cartel reached a fever pitch. The U.S. Embassy in Dublin issued a statement specifically condemning the murder and linking it directly to the Kinahan organization. This was a significant diplomatic move, elevating a local gangland killing to an issue of international concern. More importantly, the U.S. State Department had already in the previous year issued sanctions against the Kinahan Cartel leadership. A reward of $5 million was offered for information leading to the arrest and conviction of the Kinahan bosses. The murder of Liam Roe was used as a contemporary example of the cartel's brutality, reinforcing the justification for this global hunt. In Spain, the Guardia Civil intensified their operations. The Kinahan leadership, based primarily in Dubai, used Spain as a key logistical and financial hub for their European operations. The Spanish police understood that cutting off this limb was crucial to crippling the beast. They made several arrests and seizures, directly referencing the Kinahan-Hutch feud and its associated violence, including the murder of Roe, as motivation for their crackdown. The European Union Agency for Law Enforcement Cooperation, Europol, also became deeply involved. They facilitated intelligence sharing between the Gardaí, Spanish police, and other European forces. The message was unified and clear. The Kinahan Cartel is a transnational threat, and we will combat it with a transnational response. Liam Roe's death, therefore, had an unintended consequence. It did not just eliminate a cartel lieutenant, it provided fresh impetus and justification for the global coalition that was forming against the organization he served. His killing became a case study in the real-world impact of the cartel's actions, fueling the legal and financial fire that was closing in on Daniel Kinahan and his inner circle. For the community in Dublin, the fallout was more immediate and more personal. The Gardaí maintained a highly visible presence in potential flashpoint areas. The Criminal Assets Bureau continued its work seizing properties and cars linked to both factions, ensuring that the financial rewards of this bloody war were constantly under threat. For the family of Liam Roe, there was only grief and the difficult task of arranging a funeral under the watchful eyes of the media and the police. The funeral itself was a tense affair. It was a gathering of associates, a show of strength and respect, but also a potential target. The Gardaí monitored it closely, aware that such events could be a trigger for further violence. He was buried, but the conflict he was a part of was very much alive. So what is the legacy of Liam Bop Roe? He is not a romantic figure. He is a cautionary tale. His life story charts the trajectory of so many in the gangland world. The allure of quick money and respect, the rise through the ranks, the intoxicating power, and then the inevitable, brutal collapse. He achieved a certain status, but it was a status that cost him his freedom, his peace of mind, and ultimately his life. He became a pawn in a much larger game, a foot soldier in a global criminal enterprise whose leaders operated from a safe distance. His death did not end the Kinahan-Hutch feud. It simply added another name to the long and growing list of the dead. It reinforced the grim reality that in this world there are no retirement plans. There are only two ways out: a prison cell or a coffin. Liam Roe found his way out on a quiet street in Kilister, a stark symbol of a war with no winners, only survivors and victims. The global hunt for the cartel's leadership continues. The Gardaí investigations into his murder remain open. The story is not over, but the chapter on Liam Bop Roe is closed, a brutal life met with a brutal end. His story serves as a dark reminder of the true cost of organized crime, a cost paid not in currency, but in blood.